You think you know the Black Death? The plague that killed half of Europe in the 14th century? Think again. This wasn't just a disease. It was a living horror that turned cities into corpse-filled wastelands, drove people to burn their neighbors alive, and left survivors praying to a god who seemed to have abandoned them. From oozing buboes that burst with black pus to streets so choked with bodies that dogs feasted openly, the Black Death was a nightmare that makes modern pandemics look like a sniffle. Buckle up, because these gruesome truths will make your blood run cold and change everything you thought you knew about history's deadliest plague. It's 1346, and Europe is about to face its darkest hour. A mysterious sickness creeps in from the east, carried by fleas on rats aboard trading ships. It hits Sicily first, in the port of Messina, and what happens next is straight out of a horror movie. Ships drift into harbor with crews already dead, their bodies bloated and bursting, oozing black pus that smells like rotting meat. A chronicler from Messina wrote that the stench was so bad, it drove dock workers to vomit, some collapsing from the sight alone. Within weeks, the Black Death spreads like wildfire, tearing through Italy, France, England, and beyond. This wasn't just any disease. It was Yersinia pestis, a bacterium so deadly it could kill in days. Victims woke up with fever and chills, then developed massive egg-sized swellings, buboes in their groins, armpits, and necks. These weren't just lumps. They were pulsating horrors that burst open, spraying pus and blood. Some coughed up black bile, their lungs dissolving in a form called Bubonic Plague, so contagious it could spread through a single breath. A Florentine chronicler, Agnolo di Tura, described burying his 5 children with his own hands, their bodies so decayed they crumbled as he laid them in the ground. He wrote, "No one could bear the smell of the dead, but we had no choice." By 1353, the Black Death killed up to 50% of Europe. 50 million people. Entire towns vanished, their streets silent except for the buzz of flies. In London, mass graves were dug so deep they hit groundwater, bodies stacked like firewood, leaking fluids that turned the soil black. This wasn't just a plague, it was the apocalypse, and Europe was drowning in its own dead. The Black Death didn't just kill. It turned life into a grotesque nightmare. Imagine walking through Paris or Florence, where the air reeks of decay so strongly you gag with every step. Carts creak through the streets, piled high with corpses, some still twitching as if refusing to die. In Siena, one chronicler wrote that dogs and pigs tore into bodies left unburied, their jaws dripping with human flesh. The smell was so bad that survivors burned incense or held vinegar-soaked cloths to their faces, but nothing could mask the stench of a city rotting alive. Victims suffered horrors you can't imagine. Buboes grew so large they split the skin, leaking pus that burned like acid. Some developed gangrene, their fingers and toes turning black and falling off before they died. Others bled internally, their skin blotched with dark spots, hence the name Black Death. A monk in Ireland described victims vomiting their own entrails, their screams echoing through monasteries as monks abandoned their vows and fled. Doctors were useless, wearing creepy bird masks stuffed with herbs, thinking it would protect them. It didn't. Most died, their beaks stained with the blood of their patients. Families turned on each other. Parents abandoned sick children, husbands left dying wives, and priests refused to give last rites, terrified of catching the plague. In Avignon, the Pope's own city, so many died that the Rhone River was consecrated as a graveyard, with bodies dumped into the water like garbage. One account says the river ran red with blood and pus, fish dying from the poison. The Black Death didn't just take lives, it stripped away humanity, leaving a world where the living envied the dead. As the plague ravaged Europe, people didn't just die, they lost their minds. Enter the flagellants, fanatical cults who believed the Black Death was God's wrath for humanity's sins. Their solution? Whip themselves bloody in public to beg for mercy. This wasn't some quiet ritual. It was a horrifying spectacle that turned towns into scenes of pure chaos. Flagellant bands, hundreds strong, marched through Germany, France, and the Low Countries, stripped to their waists, wielding whips spiked with nails and thorns. They lashed themselves until their backs were raw, blood spraying the cobblestones as they chanted apocalyptic hymns. A German chronicler described a group in Strasbourg where the flagellants' wounds were so deep you could see their ribs, yet they kept whipping, screaming that the end was near. Crowds gathered, some joining in, others fainting from the sight. The smell of blood mixed with the ever-present stench of plague corpses, creating an atmosphere straight out of hell. Here's the sick part. The flagellants spread the plague further. Their open wounds were magnets for fleas, and their marches carried the disease from town to town. In some places, they attacked anyone who opposed them, beating priests or townsfolk who questioned their methods. The Pope banned them in 1349, calling them heretics, but not before they'd whipped their way across Europe, leaving trails of blood and infection. One account from Flanders says a group whipped themselves so hard that several died on the spot, their bodies left as offerings to God. This wasn't faith, it was madness, and it turned the plague into a blood-soaked circus. When people weren't whipping themselves, they were looking for someone to blame, and they found a target: Jewish communities. The Black Death unleashed a wave of anti-Semitic violence so brutal it makes your stomach churn. Rumors spread that Jews were poisoning wells to cause the plague, and entire towns turned into murderous mobs, fueled by fear and ignorance. In February 1349, Strasbourg saw one of the worst massacres. Over 2,000 Jews, men, women, children, were dragged to a massive pyre in the city's cemetery and burned alive. Their screams echoed as flames consumed them. Some offered baptism to escape, only to be thrown back into the fire when they refused. A chronicler wrote that the smell of burning flesh lingered for days, and ashes fell like snow, blocking the sun. In Mainz, Germany, 6,000 Jews were slaughtered, their bodies piled in the streets for rats and dogs to devour. In Cologne, a rabbi was forced to watch his family burn before being hacked apart, the crowd cheering as his blood soaked the ground. These weren't isolated incidents. Hundreds of Jewish communities were wiped out across Europe. In some towns, Jews were locked in wooden houses and set ablaze, their cries drowned by the crackling flames. The violence made the plague worse, as massacres disrupted sanitation and left bodies to rot, spreading fleas. The church and local leaders often stood by, some even fanning the flames with sermons blaming Jews. This wasn't just scapegoating, it was a genocide born of panic, and the Black Death gave it a bloody excuse. By 1353, the Black Death began to fade, but it left Europe a broken wasteland. Up to 50 million were dead, half the continent. Entire villages stood empty, their houses filled with skeletons. Fields rotted with unharvested crops, and cities like Florence lost so many people, their streets were silent except for the howl of stray dogs. The economy collapsed, with survivors hoarding gold while bodies piled up outside their doors. The church's power crumbled as priests died or fled, leaving altars empty and faith in tatters. The psychological scars were even worse. Survivors reported plague ghosts, claiming they saw the dead walking at night, their faces bloated with buboes. In England, children sang grim nursery rhymes like Ring Around the Rosie. Some say a chilling echo of the plague's symptoms: red rashes, sneezing, and death. Art became obsessed with mortality. The danse macabre emerged, paintings and woodcuts showing skeletons leading kings and peasants to their graves. One French chronicler wrote that survivors swore they could still smell the rot years later, as if the plague had cursed the air itself. The Black Death didn't just kill, it reshaped history. It weakened feudalism, as labor shortages gave peasants leverage to demand better wages. It fueled the Renaissance, as survivors questioned old authorities and sought new knowledge. But it also left a legacy of fear, superstition, and death worship, where the line between life and death blurred forever. This was no ordinary pandemic. It was a monster that broke Europe's body and soul. So there you have it. The Black Death, a plague so horrific it turned cities into rotting graveyards, drove fanatics to whip themselves bloody, and burned innocent people alive. This wasn't just a disease. It was a real-life apocalypse that left 50 million dead and a continent haunted by its own ghosts. From oozing buboes to rivers of corpses, the Black Death was history's ultimate horror show, and its scars still linger in our nightmares. Drop a comment. What's the creepiest Black Death fact you just learned? Smash that subscribe button and hit that bell so you don't miss our next video. It's going to be another wild ride.